Hello and welcome to MAN301 Strategic Management. This is week 9, module 9, in which we look at corporate governance from a strategic management perspective. I'm going to review a little bit in this class about accounting and corporate governance and draw it back to your understanding of agency relationships, but we are predominantly looking at the strategic implications of corporate governance. So what are we going to do in this module? Well, on successful completion of this module, you'll be able to define corporate governance and explain why it is used to monitor and control managers' decisions, managers' strategic decisions, explain how ownership has been largely separated from managerial control in the modern corporation, define an agency relationship and the managerial opportunism that can arise, and describe their importance to the strategic management and governance. And then we're going to look at the mechanisms of control in objectives 3 and 4. We're going to look at 3 internal governance mechanisms: ownership concentration, the board of directors, and executive compensation, and how they're used to monitor and control managerial decisions. And we're going to look at the external corporate governance mechanism, which is the market for corporate control, and how that acts as a restraint to top level managers' strategic decision making. Okay, so let's get started with objective 1, which is how we're going to define corporate governance and explain why it's used to monitor and control managers' strategic decisions. So our definition, the definition that we're using in this course, is that corporate governance represents the set of mechanisms used to manage the relationship among stakeholders that is used to determine and control the strategic direction and the performance of organisations. Now, corporate governance is just not focused, it's not only focused on managers. It's the area where owners, managers and members of the boards of directors may have some conflicts of interest, but they're all focused on how is it best to manage and control the organisation, to set its strategic direction, to monitor its performance. The mechanisms that exist, the mechanisms we're going to focus on, are 3 internal governance mechanisms: ownership concentration, that's the proportion that is owned by particular shareholders, board of directors, and executive compensation. Pardon me, a little bit of a COVID cough there. And then we're going to look at our external governance mechanisms, which is the market for corporate control. Now, in your accounting topics, you may have had a broader range of issues and many financial and ratio and regulatory roles that define what corporate governance is. All of those things are true. All of those things are the techniques and mechanisms that are used to implement these broader governance mechanisms, to provide information necessary for managers, owners, and shareholders to make decisions about organisations. And when I say managers, owners, and shareholders, I should also mention that in the market for corporate control, there are also external potential shareholders, potential stakeholders that may have an interest in the organisation's strategic direction and the organisation's performance. So let's look at the broad statements about these governance mechanisms before we move on to focusing on the objectives on agency theory and corporate structure, and then the 2 more extensive discussions of our internal mechanisms and internal mechanisms. So the ownership concentration. Broadly, when there's a relatively high amount of shares owned by an individual shareholder or individual investor, or investor institutions, that means that they have some level of ownership concentration. So Rupert Murdoch's family, which only owns 30%, but they own a significantly higher percentage than 30% of the voting shares of News Corp. That's a concentrated ownership. The board of directors are individuals responsible for representing the firm's owners by monitoring top-level managers' strategic decisions. And executive compensation, that's the use of salary, bonuses and long-term incentives to align the interests of managers with the interests of shareholders. Now you'll notice that we are focusing in our discussion of corporate governance on the relationship between the owners and the relationship between the managers of the organisation and the board of directors as the representative of the firm's owners. In the external governance mechanism, in the area of external governance, the key mechanism for external governance is the market for corporate control. If a firm is underperforming relative to its industry rivals, that may mean that is attractive to be taken over by external stakeholders. Now, there's also a case to be made that if the firm is doing very well, that also attracts takeover offers, and they may in fact be takeover offers that have a positive impact on the organisation. But the market for corporate control is often looked at as in response to organisations that are underperforming, because in a way it's about organisations underperforming, therefore it creates risk to the owners, risk to the managers. They want to be high performing, particularly risk to the managers, because the organisation will be taken over. And those managers may or may not have a job. So that's objective 1 and 2. So that's the end of part 1 of the lecture. So that's actually the introduction at objective 1, and that's the end of part 1 of the lecture. We're going to take a break. There's a video for you to watch, and then we're going to move on to looking at objective 2, which is the why ownership has been largely separated from managerial control in the modern corporation. So a little bit of a history lesson on the way that corporations have evolved, and there'll be some supporting videos for that. And then we're going to look at the specific issue of agency relationships in objective 3.